From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will offer his impressions of the row crop production season in Kansas as harvest winds down and what may have been learned that will be useful to you growers next year. Then, from the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, a look at assessing hay resources for the cow-calf herd before winter weather sets in for the long pull. Contributing to that conversation, K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, Bob Weaber, and Dustin Pendell. Later this week's horticulture segment, then, Jeff Wickman talks with K-State's Dennis Patton about using those fallen leaves from the yard as a mulch or as an organic resource for the garden. All that here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Thanks for tuning in to Agriculture Today. At long last, the row crop harvest in Kansas is showing some semblance of winding down now. We're getting closer to finishing up for another production year. We've invited by today crop production specialist Ignacio Ciampitti, K-State Research and Extension, to randomly pull up some thoughts on this growing season just past, some things that might have been learned from it, and some of the experiences that you producers can draw from looking forward to the next row crop production year. It was a broad array of conditions for our row crop producers in Kansas, and you hear this from more than a few producers that as they've pushed their way through the corn harvest, through the soybean harvest, they are finding that, to their surprise, more than a few fields are exceeding expectations. The yields aren't too bad, Ignacio.
Yeah. If you look at all the conditions that we went through this year, if you look at all the pessimism of planting late, of being too wet, of having the issue of thinking that we were too short in terms of growing season, when you start looking at the corn yields, I think that we have this feeling of overall very adequate yields. We are probably around the mean or a little bit above the mean. And I think that when you start doing this kind of a review of the entire growing season, yes, we were late. Yes, our growing season was quite short compared with previous years. But for the size of the season, the length of the duration that we have, when you start looking at your entire season in terms of precipitation during the season in many places and temperature, it was not that bad. Compared with what we suffer in many years in Kansas when we talk about heat and we talk about drought. How many times this summer we were talking about heat? Extreme heat events.
Very few instances.
Very few. So that is one of the main factors affecting yields. For corn, extreme heat event at flowering time, it can cut 20, 30, 40% of the yields depending if it's really extremely timely. So this year we have just, in fact, the opposite in many situations. We have many farmers asking us, Ignacio, what do you think about planting this relative maturity? Do you think that I will make it? Because they were looking at the beginning of the season, which beginning, we might need to clarify that for many of them were like mid-May, early June beginning. And they were looking that they didn't have enough heat. They were quite concerned of saying, if we don't get more heat during the summer, and we are so late, that we might be able, ending in trouble and not finishing the crop. Then we never really have what we were expecting also on a too early freeze event. No. So having an extended duration of our end of the growing season really help us in many situations, many yields, in many environments. Still, if you discuss with many farmers, there were some part of the crop that didn't fully achieve the maximum weight.
There were some bad yields out there too.
Yeah, there is no question about that. I would say there were some farmers that they talked to us and they were really concerned that kind of a freeze event impact. Some, for example, soybeans when they were not really fully mature. For those environments, some of those guys, still they got, discussing with them, some respectable yields. So overall, looking at the way that we start early in the season, I think that we got a good deal.
In those circumstances where yields did exceed expectations, can improved seed genetics be credited for some of that, perhaps, Ignacio?
I would say yes, but you shouldn't be looking only for last year. So we need to look at what happened in the last maybe 30, 40 years on our yield improvement and genetics. And remember that sometimes we just emphasize the genetics, but the genetics is involving also the environment and the management. Fertilizing the crops, looking for the best practices in terms of density, row spacing. So that technology pack is basically what is helping us to succeed and at least to have, I would say, more stability. I would say more, not only the genetics, but I would say all the improvement that we did in the management of the crop, in using more technology. I think that today we can see that we are increasing the stability. And I'm hoping that we can become better on this, because for me it's not always to discuss about getting high yields, but also to make sure that our farmers are getting stable yields. If you ask to any farmers, they will tell you that if they need to pick a scenario of getting 120 bushels every year versus getting 1 year 180 and the next 70, I think that they will be telling you the 120 every year is what I want.
Reliability is everything.
Reliability is everything. So, and I think that the yield stability is one of the key factors, that we start seeing over time. We cannot neglect that we have improvements on yields in the last 30 years, and that improvements are very clear in corn, in soybeans, and in sorghum. I think that those are key factors to help us to become much better on managing the crops. I think if you look at all those conditions, I think that the genetics is a key factor, and then the management, as we discussed in many situations, for example, the plant density for corn. This year was one of the years that some of the guys that they were a little more aggressive on the corn side.
Are those the sorts of things you'll be talking up then as you head into the row crop production schools here in the winter, seeding populations, for instance? Those things are really standing out in a year like this?
Yeah, I think that we need to, this year, on the winter schools, I think that our main focus is, of course, this idea of planting through the stress. What are the management strategies that we need to use in terms of facing challenges like this year? For example, this year was late planting. People was asking questions about changing maturities, increasing seeding rates. And then we are also trying to introduce the topic of the relative maturity connected to the drying down, because the drying down conditions that we have this year and how quickly we got from black layer, from maturity to harvest, it is also something that we need to become more aware to understand the entire season, not just when you're harvesting the crop, not only when the crop is done. In corn, I think that those are some of the key factors. And then when you look at soybeans, we have some issues of inoculation in some places because flooding conditions or saturated soils produce some problems of having an effective bacteria and fixation of nitrogen. So there were very small pockets, but we have a few issues on that inoculation. So we'll be talking about that in many of our meetings. Also, this was one of the years that row spacing could play a big factor, and some of the data that we are collecting is showing us that when we are getting those rows closer, and then if we have the rain, so if water is not a limiting factor, it's becoming less limiting. So increasing your seeding rates, we have some studies that we tried increasing seeding rates by 5-10% and looking at narrowing rows. And then basically what was our final goal was to increase the competition and make sure those plants, they compete and they close the canopy much faster. And then with that idea, what we are gaining is we're gaining the concept of adding days that we don't have, in fact, and then making sure that the crop is kind of moving all the progression of phenology and growth faster, as if it's in a scenario that basically we're not pushing high densities or we are just on white rows. And then on sorghum, in many situations, we did a few changes or recommendations to change on maturity, and then we were successful in finishing the crops. The drying down is another factor that we need to discuss on sorghum. The drying down basically is limiting us today, at least with this particular season, of having that ability farmers can just get the crop out and make sure that they can keep going.
The upside of this is, Ignacio, this growing season and all its peculiarities has allowed you and your research team to gather data on these matters, and you'll be sharing that at the aforementioned meetings. And this should render some ideas on how producers could manage more efficiently and effectively yet in 2020.
Yeah, I think that we were able to, as you describe it quite well, to collect a wealth of knowledge and data from this current growing season. One of the main questions that we are all asking ourselves, at this point, is that is 2019 just an exceptional year or is the norm? And then we will start seeing more extreme events as we have seen on 2019. And it's challenging to think in a more innovative way. Innovative approaches on how to basically overcome those problems.
It's forcing producers to be adaptable.
I think that's exactly right. I think that is really forcing producers to think out of the box.
And toward that end, you'll be talking with producers and sharing the information as you churn through all of that data and come up with some findings from this 2019 production year that will hopefully be helpful along that line. Thanks for the word, Ignacio. As always, we'll touch base again soon.
Thanks, Eric, for the invitation.
That from Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, some of his reflections on what we might well have learned from the irregularities of the corn, sorghum, and soybean production season 2019 here in Kansas. This is Agriculture Today, and we'll be back with more after a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, another conversation on cow-calf herd management via the latest Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. And this time, all the regulars are on board. Veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, and livestock economist Dustin Pendell, as they'll take on a couple of topics ripe for this fall to winter transition we'll be entering soon. As usual, Brad leads it off.
We're going to talk about planting hay and hay utilization for the winter season. Then we'll talk a little bit about, it's that time of year, we're weaning calves, we're assessing how did the year go, and we're going to talk about what can we do to measure productivity. We've had a good year here locally as far as hay production, but in other areas you may not have as much hay, or you may be asking the question, do I have enough hay? And can you guys tell me, if I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the hay, I'm looking at the cattle, how do I make that assessment for this time of year going into winter feeding?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brad. And I sort of been mentally going through this little exercise, and I think, really three things come to mind. One is, how much grazing do you anticipate being able to do through winter? So here locally, we've got a lot of residual forage yet from a really good summer. So thinking how do we leverage that versus putting mechanically harvested feed in front of them. So figuring that out and how many days you'll be able to defer hay feeding. The second piece really is what's your protein supplementation strategy for the standing dormant forage? And if you don't have one, then maybe using some of the hay that you've harvested that's better quality may make sense from a cost standpoint. And then the third one is kind of when do you anticipate calving? So figuring out how many days of dry cow feeding do I have versus lactating cow feeding, and those will have different nutrient requirements, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think coming back to one of the questions is if I have standing dormant forage, and the Ag Economist paper that I read one time basically, and again, this is going to vary depending on the situation, but assuming that we have to maybe supplement protein on that standing dormant forage, our cost of the feed itself is similar to the cost of hay feeding, but the cost of delivery, manure management, all those kinds of things are an advantage for grazing standing dormant forage. But then there's going to be parts of Kansas where there's not much standing forage, and so you're talking about more days of hay feeding. So I agree. How many days do I really think I'm going to need?
And I think one of the a good rule of thumb I use is if I have a decent amount of residual forage and I know I'm going to need to supplement a little bit, doing a graze half, make the cow go get half of her energy need from grazed forage, and then the other half I provide by dry hay. And then, depending on if I've got a bale processor or if I'm rolling that out, cake supplementation or some protein commodity byproduct to go on top of that to make sure that they get the most out of the grazed forage that they can. But if you do that, so you're at a 50% supplementation rate for hay, that means she probably needs about 1% to 1.25% of her body weight per day in hay provided, plus whatever wastage you need to figure into that equation.
So then we start talking about, I need to count number of days. Then I need to count, what's my cow size? The number that I was taught that I oftentimes use is they're probably going to consume about 2% of their body weight in dry hay. Now, there's going to be some wastage, and so I think you should, for just a simple calculation, is bump that up 2.25% of their body weight supplied to them. So then you figure out, I've got 100 cows and they weigh about 1,400 pounds. Multiply that out and then do 2.5% is what I really want to deliver to them per day, and then count how many days, and then start counting bales. Do I have enough to meet that need?
So on a 1,400-pound cow at 2.5% supplementation rate, that's 35 pounds of dry hay per day.
Yeah, and I don't think she's going to consume 35 pounds, but she's going to go through that much with the wastage. So then,
one way to track that is how often am I putting those bales out? So I need to make an estimate early this time of year before we start feeding. Okay, I think it's going to take this many bales per week or per time period. And then how many am I actually putting out? And am I way over or way under my estimate? Because I may want to go back and look.
I may be wrong on my estimate of my bale weight to start with.
Or my cow weight or my wastage.
So I could be off on any of those.
And I assume it's also a function of the weather.
Yep.
When you're going to start.
Absolutely. That's the other thing is we got to account for some of those events where we may be putting out an extra bale because it's really cold or it's really snowy, or they can't get to if we've got some dormant forage to graze. But you started down the other track of, as you think about that hay, what are the other things I need to consider?
Well, I think you do need to think about wastage. How much are we going to lose? Because the cow is going to try to consume about 2% of her body weight, but how much hay will it take to actually supply that? And we can have some loss in storage, and so selecting good places to store the hay. And again, what I was taught is basically, get it on an area where you're not going to have mud or moisture wicking up from the bottom. So that might be a rock base. I've seen guys just clean dirt off of the Flint Hills until you're down to some rock, so you're putting on rock. I've seen guys put the hay on pallets, but some way to avoid water coming up from the bottom. And then basically deciding there's some differences in different parts of Kansas on how much benefit there is from covering the hay. The more moisture you're going to get, the more value there's going to be to putting some plastic or putting them in a shed or something like that. As farther west you go, the lower the rainfall, then the less value there's going to be to covering the hay. But keeping in mind some way to control the loss during storage. And then you've got the loss as you feed the cattle too. And a lot of that has to do with the forage quality itself, in that the lower the quality, first of all, the cows aren't going to eat as much physically, and the other is they'll sort through it more, and then they'll leave more on the ground. Yeah. And so again, I hadn't really thought, what you were saying, is not only do the math ahead of time, but then how much am I delivering? Because I could be way off on how much I think they're going to waste. And cows can waste a relatively small amount, or they could waste, I think the worst case scenario is maybe up to half in all losses. And so kind of track that and see how bad is it this year? How much wastage do I really have?
What is a normal? Is it 20% wastage? I mean, every operation is going to be different.
Every operation is going to be different, but that's probably where I would start. Just if I want to make a nice, safe, good guess, is I'm going to waste 20%. And then monitor it and see if I'm doing better than that this year or worse. But I think that's a good place to start.
Last topic we wanted to talk about today was measuring performance in our calves. One of the questions that comes up is, we put all this work into it, we send our calf crop to the sale or we wean them, how well did I do? And one of the ways that we measure is weaning weight. Often we'll take that, or potentially sale weight when we take them and we get a ticket on the calves when they sell. I've heard people discuss an adjusted weaning weight that allows me to better evaluate an individual cow. Say I had a heifer that calved a little bit later than the cows and her calf was a little bit smaller. Should I adjust her weaning weight to better account for her genetic potential than necessarily my cow, even though she calved a little bit later?
Yeah, I think this is an area where there's a fair bit of debate. And I think a lot of it comes down to, one, what is it you're trying to improve? And two, what does the adjusted weaning weight describe? And I think, you said adjusted weaning weight is a reflection of cow. I think that's not the right sort of strategy. Adjusted weaning weight is to adjust for differences in age when comparing calves. Okay, when we want to look at cow productivity, the pounds that she delivers to the sale is the pounds she delivers to the sale. And that's the economic important bit. And so, although it's influenced by age, if we correct age out of it, we discount cows that calve early, the ones we want, versus the ones that calve late, which are the ones that we don't want.
That adjusted, the adjusted weaning weight really came from the purebred side, trying to get a handle on genetics of growth from birth to weaning. I don't like to take that idea and transfer that to commercial production, because I agree totally with what Dr. Weber said. Is it's really about the pounds that I deliver, because that's my income side. I want to measure something that has economic value, and the actual weaning weight has economic value.
And to take it even to more of an economic analysis of the business unit, weaning weight per cow exposed is even better, right? Because the weaning weights of calves represent all of the realized successes, so everything that went right from when I turned bulls with cows to when I got them to harvest, and none of the managerial losses or reproductive losses or any other loss in that process. And so capturing enough data in your system to understand the inventory at bull exposure, and then subsequently how many pounds of calf product did I produce over that production period.
Well, it comes down to really year to year. The weaning weight is basically my income in the numerator, and you're dividing it by number of cows exposed, which is a pretty good proxy for my expenses, for all my costs. Yeah.
So you guys would rather look at no adjustments, actual sale weights.
I don't like adjustments for commercial herds.
And even
and as a culling criteria, even a cow that's bred late and is pregnant,
she's not worth as much.
She's not worth as much, regardless of her genetics, but she's worth more than the one that's open.
That is true.
Yeah. So the relative comparison there is really, did they get pregnant at the right time, and can we get them bred early?
Yeah, once you've got them in the herd, she's got to do something really sideways to leave. Otherwise, you have a big capital loss that goes with her.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, Bob Weaber, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, and Brad White. Be sure to take in the entire podcast at beefcattleinstitute.org. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today is back now for this week's horticulture segment. And for that, we hand it on over to the K-State Radio Network's Jeff Wickman. Jeff?
Johnson County Extension horticulture agent Dennis Patton says that once leaves are composted or break down naturally, they are an excellent source of organic matter for soil.
You know, when you think about leaves, most people think about them being trash. But actually, if you really kind of look at them as being a treasure, it gives you a whole another way to think about them. But you're right. On the lawn themselves, if they pile up over winter, they're going to suffocate out the lawn. They're going to exclude the sunlight, and then you're going to have thin, dead areas come spring. So one way or another, you need to get those leaves up off the grass itself so you'll have a healthy lawn come next spring.
So what are some of the options then?
Well, you know, the traditional way to do that is get out the leaf rake and do a lot of hand work. But I actually like mulch mowing. So what happens is after you get just a thin layer of leaves on the lawn, not 6-8 inches, but just a thin layer, just a light covering, is take the bagger off your mower and mow over the leaves. And then the mower will chop and shred those leaves, and then they'll filter back to the soil surface. And research out of other institutions, extension like Michigan State, has found that you can probably mulch mow safely up to 6 to 8 inches of leaves back into the turf. Now that's multiple mowings, not one mowing. Then that just chops, shreds the leaves, and then they naturally break down, compost at the soil level, and release a little bit of nutrient organic matter back to the soil itself. What I kind of tell people is once you stop seeing grass, it's probably time to get the mower out. And then you know you're safely mulch mowing when you kind of turn around, look behind you, and what you see is a majority of grass and a few little pieces of leaves here and there. If you look behind you, you see mostly leaves, then you probably waited too long between those mulch mowings. Let's say you let too many leaves fall and you can't use the mulch mowing. So what I do the first time is I'll take the bagger off the mower and I'll just kind of mow helter-skelter through the lawn and let the mower chop. Then the second time I'll go through, I'll put the bagger back on and then pick up the leaves. Because if you have the bagger on the first time on most mowers, it doesn't chop the leaves, it just sucks them in whole. And you end up with this bulk. So if you let the mower chop them the first time and some filter through, then put that bagging attachment back on, go through the second time, you'll probably cut the amount of volume you have in half, maybe even 3/4. Then you have just little thin shards of leaves, which are a lot easier to use in the compost pile, use as a mulch around your landscape plants. I like to hold them till next year and then use them to mulch my vegetable garden. Other options you can do with those leaves is if you've got some shrub areas, under tree shrubs around where you normally put wood mulch down, you can use leaf mulch as that. Or you can just hold them. Like I said earlier, I kind of like to put my leaves in my compost bin. And if I make compost over the winter, I do. If I don't, I don't. And then I mulch around my tomato plants, my pepper plants, my vegetable gardens next year. Or you can also work them in as a soil amendment as the whole and let them compost in ground over winter. And usually you can probably compost in the ground 3 to 4 inches of shredded leaves. And that's about the same layer you'd use as a mulch layer, whether it's around the tree shrubs or your vegetable garden, probably around 3 to 4 inches of leaves. So really that mass of leaves, once you chip and shred them, doesn't go as far as you would really think they would. Now, if you've got that really heavily tree neighborhood, big old oak trees or sycamore trees with a lot of large leaves, that's going to go a lot farther than those little fine leaves coming off an elm, a honey locust tree, or something like that. Not all leaves are created equal, kind of like a lot of things. Some are coarse, some break down, some shred, some compact more. It just kind of depends on the tree they're coming from. The nice thing about using the leaves in the vegetable garden is they're all organic. So by the end of the season, they're pretty much broken down into organic matter naturally. They can be turned over and that next year's layer of leaves can be added. It's just kind of a continual renewal process.
And what should we be doing in the garden right now?
I think at this time of year, I think the cleanup is one thing. A lot of parts of Kansas have already had their first frost. The tomatoes have been killed. The peppers have been killed. So cleanup is always most important because there are some diseases that overwinter on that old debris. Getting all those old tomato vine peppers out of there, pretty much everything. Also, any weeds that you have in the garden, get those out of there because they're just going to be loaded with seeds. Then you could also spade or till the soil. And I really recommend people that love the vegetable garden do their tillage in the fall because a lot of times in Kansas come spring we have wet weather. You can't get in there and work. It delays planting. So I like to do just what I call a rough till. So go in there, depending on the size of the garden. Mine's fairly small. I hand spade it, but I just leave it really kind of chunky. And then over the freezing and thawing of winter, all I have to do come March, April, hit it with a rake, and I'm ready to plant. And then you don't have to worry as much about those wet soils because you've already done your major tillage. You can also work those leaves into the garden so you're ready to go next spring.
And the good thing is if you're doing that tilling, you can also put some in a bag and get it off for a soil test?
Actually, that's a great idea because I know we get bombarded with soil tests in the spring, and then people get a little impatient. They expect to get the results back in a day or two, and it takes, a couple weeks to get the results back. So the nice thing about soil testing through any K-State Extension office is that you'll have those results come spring when you're ready to plant, or if there's a pH change, you need to add some lime or some sulfur to the soil to change that pH. You can do it this fall, and then you have all winter for that change to start taking place because you can work it in, incorporating the soil. So yeah, soil testing is easy to do. You need basically a cup of soil brought into your local extension office. We zip it off to K-State. They do all the analysis, and then we email you back the results, and you're good to go for the next 3 to 5 years.
And is this from different locations throughout the garden?
Right. The bigger the garden, the more random samples you want to take. So for an average sized garden, half a dozen to maybe a larger, 10,000 square foot garden, maybe 10 or 12 samples. Maybe go down 4, 5, 6 inches deep, take small samples, mix them all together in a clean bucket. So you're going to collect more than that cup or 2 cups of soil. But what we're trying to get is a representative, uniform sample of the entire garden. And so that's why I want the multiple samples mixed together to give us that uniform reading from the entire garden area, just not one spot.
In terms of what we should be thinking about as we head into winter, not quite time to put the mower away just yet, but there are some things that we could probably start doing.
Good point about putting the mower away. We just talked about using the mower to pick up the leaves, but really we want to keep that mowing up until the grass stops its growth. Now, for those with warm season grasses, the zoysia, the Bermuda grass, that first frost, they're done for the season. In northeast Kansas, where I'm from, in Johnson County, our majority of lawns are cool season lawns, bluegrass, tall fescue lawns, and those will continue to grow up, in a warm November, maybe even up to Thanksgiving. So you want to send that lawn into the winter at the same mowing height you've been mowing at all summer long. So, like on a zoysia Bermuda lawn, maybe a couple inches. For that bluegrass tall fescue lawn, probably around 3 inches, and just send them in. And then come spring, you want to drop that mowing height maybe a notch to pick up some of that debris. But for the most part, mow as needed so you have a nice lawn going into winter months. And you'll be amazed that sometimes putting new wheels on will add a half an inch back to the mowing height where you thought you might be mowing fairly high based on the settings. But those wheels do need to be updated from time to time because they wear down.
That's Johnson County K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent Dennis Patton. I'm Jeff Wickman.
Thanks, Jeff. And once more, our time is away for this edition. Thanks to you for listening in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.